I never thought I would be the one to betray him. James, my husband of 6 years, had always been my rock. We met when I was just starting out in marketing, and he was a promising lawyer. His ambition, his drive, they inspired me, made me believe in a future where we'd conquer the world together. But life has a way of pulling you in directions you never expected, tearing at the seams of what once felt so secure. It started about a year ago when James landed the biggest case of his career. It was the kind of case that could make or break him as a lawyer. He had been working tirelessly for months, pouring everything he had into preparing. I could see the pressure building, the strain it put on him, and the toll it took on our marriage. We barely had time for each other anymore, and when we did, the tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. I tried to be understanding. I knew how much this meant to him, how badly he wanted to succeed. But there was something else too, an unspoken fear lurking in his eyes. He was up against the firm of Alexander Grayson, a ruthless corporate lawyer who had never lost a case. Grayson wasn't just any opponent, he was a man with deep connections in the industry, someone who could destroy careers as easily as he built them. And now, James's future was in his hands. It was around this time that I met Grayson. I never wanted to cross paths with him, but it was inevitable. James had been invited to a high-profile event where all the major players would be, and he insisted I come along for support. I remember feeling out of place in the extravagant ballroom, filled with men in tailored suits and women dripping in diamonds. Grayson spotted us almost immediately, and to my surprise, he made his way over, smiling that smug, self-assured smile I had only heard about in stories. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His eyes lingered on me a little too long when James introduced us. "So, this is the famous Samantha I've heard so much about," he said, his voice low and smooth. There was something predatory in the way he said it, something that made me uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, Grayson became a constant presence. He seemed to pop up at every event, every dinner, every function James was involved in. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but soon it became clear, he was targeting me. He knew how much James depended on this case, how much it meant to him, and he knew that I was his weak spot. Grayson started making advances, subtle at first, a lingering touch, a compliment whispered in my ear when no one was listening. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into his actions. But deep down, I knew. He wanted something from me, and I wasn't sure how far he would go to get it. Then, one night, everything changed. James was working late at the office, and I was alone at home when my phone buzzed with a message from Grayson. He wanted to meet. I should have ignored it, I should have deleted it without a second thought, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it was the isolation, the growing distance between James and me, or maybe it was the fear gnawing at my gut that his career was hanging by a thread. Whatever the reason, I agreed to meet him. We met at a secluded bar downtown, far enough away that no one would recognize us. I remember sitting across from him, my heart pounding in my chest as he leaned in close and said the words that would change everything, "I can make this all go away." I blinked, not sure I had heard him right. "What do you mean?" He smiled, that same smug, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "The case. James's career. I can make sure he wins. You know how much influence I have, Samantha. I can pull the right strings, make the right calls. All it takes is one night. With you." My breath caught in my throat. It was as if the world had stopped turning. I wanted to slap him, to throw my drink in his face, to storm out and never look back. But instead, I sat there, frozen, as the weight of his offer pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. One night. That's all it would take. One night, and James would win the case. His career would be saved. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at him, my mind racing. I thought about James, about everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. I thought about the late nights, the stress, the fear in his eyes every time he talked about Grayson. And then I thought about us, about the distance between us, the way we had drifted apart, the way he had thrown himself into his work, leaving me behind. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely a whisper. Okay. That night was a blur. I barely remember how I ended up in Grayson's penthouse, how I let him touch me, kiss me, take me. I felt numb, disconnected from my own body, as if I was watching it all happen from a distance. I kept telling myself it was for James, for his career, for our future. But deep down, I knew it was a lie. I had betrayed him. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. When it was over, Grayson kept his promise. He made a few calls, pulled a few strings, and just like that, James won the case. He was ecstatic, oblivious to the price I had paid for his victory. I tried to pretend that everything was okay, that I had done the right thing, but the guilt ate away at me like a cancer. Every time James smiled at me, every time he held me, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my own deception. Weeks passed, and I told myself I could live with it. I could bury the guilt, forget about that night, and move on. But the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how hard you try to suppress it. And as much as I wanted to keep it hidden, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The days after that night with Grayson blurred together, but the weight of my actions sat heavy on my chest. James was elated after the case victory, and for a while, I let myself believe that maybe this could be enough, maybe I could live with what I had done, hide it so deep that it would never resurface. After all, it was a sacrifice for him, for our future. That's what I kept telling myself, like some broken record on repeat, trying to drown out the shame. James threw himself into celebrating. We went out to dinner more often, and he was more attentive than he had been in months. It should have been enough. He was back to being the man I married, at least, on the surface. But every smile he gave me, every kiss, felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I could see the love in his eyes, the gratitude for standing by him through such a difficult time, and I hated myself for it. I hated myself for what I had done, what I had become. I avoided him as much as I could without raising suspicion. When he wrapped his arms around me at night, I'd shift just enough to make him think I was tired. When he wanted to talk about the future, about how much this win meant for his career, I'd nod and smile, but my mind was miles away, locked in that night with Grayson. I started working late, using my own job as an excuse to avoid being around him for too long. It was pathetic, really, hiding in plain sight, all because I couldn't face the truth. But Grayson was never far from my mind. He left me with more than just the stain of my betrayal. Every time I saw his name in the news, every time James mentioned him in passing, my heart would pound in my chest like I was about to be found out. I half expected Grayson to call me, to rub it in my face, to make me pay some further price for my silence. But he didn't. He let me stew in my guilt, knowing that was punishment enough. Then, a few weeks after the case was settled, it happened. It was a Tuesday night. James had just come home from the office, beaming as he told me about a new promotion he was being considered for. The firm was impressed with how he handled the case, and this promotion would put him on a whole new level. He was on cloud nine, and I tried, to be happy for him. But as we sat down for dinner, I could barely touch my food, the knot in my stomach tightening with every word he spoke. "I couldn't have done this without you, Sam," James said, reaching across the table to take my hand. His eyes were soft, full of love, and I felt my heart constrict. "You've been my rock through all of this." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I just wanted to help you," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. James smiled, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. "And you did. I don't know what I would have done without you. I feel like we're finally getting back to where we were. I know things have been tough lately, but I feel like we're stronger now." Stronger? If only he knew how weak I had been. I could barely breathe as the guilt washed over me in waves, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to confess everything, to tell him that I wasn't the woman he thought I was. But instead, I just sat there, nodding like a coward, letting him believe that everything was fine. The next day, the silence between us grew. I left for work early, hoping the routine would distract me from my thoughts. But no matter how much I buried myself in projects, Grayson's voice echoed in my head, reminding me of the price I had paid. I hadn't heard from him since that night, but his presence lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then, out of nowhere, I got a text. It was him. Miss me? My heart sank as I stared at the screen. How dare he? After everything he'd taken from me, after everything I'd lost because of him, he had the nerve to reach out to me like this? I was furious, but more than that, I was terrified. I knew Grayson didn't do anything without an ulterior motive. He always had a plan, always had something up his sleeve, and now, it seemed, he was ready to play his next card. I ignored the message, hoping it was just some sick game he was playing. But the next day, another text came. We should talk. Talk? About what? There was nothing left to say. I had done what he wanted, and James had won the case. Our deal was over, at least, that's what I had thought. But Grayson didn't play by normal rules. He had the power to destroy people, and now, it seemed, he wasn't done with me yet. Days passed, and I kept trying to ignore him. But the messages became more frequent, more insistent. I think you owe me. Let's not make this complicated, Samantha. You know where to find me. I felt trapped. No matter how much I tried to forget that night, Grayson wouldn't let me. He was playing a game, and I was his pawn, trapped in a web of lies and deceit that I couldn't escape. Every message made my skin crawl, and yet, I couldn't bring myself to block his number. I was too afraid of what he might do next, too afraid of the consequences if I ignored him for too long. Then, one evening, while James was out with colleagues celebrating his promotion, I got the call. Grayson's voice was smooth, calculated. We need to meet. Tonight. I froze, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I can't, I said, my voice shaking. He chuckled softly, that same arrogant laugh that made my blood run cold. You can. You will. Or do I need to remind you of what's at stake? I felt sick. He didn't need to remind me. I knew exactly what was at stake, my marriage, my life, everything I had worked so hard to protect. Grayson held all the cards, and he knew it. He was playing me like a puppet, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. I'll be at the same place as before, he said. Don't be late. And just like that, the call ended, leaving me standing in the middle of the kitchen, shaking. I wanted to scream, to cry, to break something, anything to release the tension building inside me. But I couldn't. Instead, I sat down at the table, my hands trembling as I stared at my phone, wondering how I had let it come to this. I knew what he wanted. It was always the same with Grayson: power, control, manipulation. He wanted to see how far he could push me, how much more I was willing to sacrifice for James's success. And the sickest part of all? I wasn't sure how far I would go to protect the life I had built with James. I showed up at the bar that night, just like Grayson had asked. The moment I walked in, I saw him, sitting in the corner, watching me with that same predatory gaze. He didn't smile this time. He didn't need to. He knew he had me. Samantha, he said, gesturing for me to sit across from him. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually, I did. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest as I waited for him to speak. You thought one night was enough, didn't you? He said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. You said that was the deal. One night, and you'd make sure James won the case. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I did say that. And I kept my promise, didn't I? But you didn't think it would be that easy, did you? I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you want? Grayson leaned forward, his gaze intense. I want what's owed to me. My stomach dropped. You got what you wanted, I said, my voice barely a whisper. James won. You got what you wanted. He chuckled darkly. Did I? You see, Samantha, men like me, men in power, we don't stop when we get what we want. We keep taking, because we can. I could feel the walls closing in around me, the air thick with dread as I realized what he was saying. Grayson wasn't finished with me. He never would be. I sat across from Grayson, my hands clasped together under the table, trying to stop him from shaking. My breath was shallow, and I felt like a deer caught in headlights, unable to move, unable to escape. Grayson's words echoed in my head, men like me keep taking because we can. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he had taken enough, that I wasn't going to let him control me any longer. But the words stuck in my throat. The truth was, I didn't know how to fight him. He held all the cards, and I was at his mercy. What do you want from me, Grayson? I asked finally, my voice small, defeated. He smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he had all the time in the world. It's simple, really. I want more of you, Samantha. I enjoyed our little arrangement the first time, but I think we both know it doesn't have to stop there. My stomach churned. I had walked into this trap willingly the first time, telling myself it was for James, that I was doing it to save his career. But now, it was clear, Grayson was never going to let me go. He had tasted power over me, and now he wanted to see how far he could push me. I can't, I whispered, shaking my head. I can't do this again. Grayson's smile faded, his eyes narrowing as he leaned forward. Oh, but you can. And you will. Because if you don't, everything you've worked so hard to protect will come crumbling down. Do you really think James would still love you if he found out what you did? Do you think he'd forgive you? My heart stopped. He was right, and I hated him for it. If James ever found out about that night with Grayson, it would destroy him. He'd never look at me the same way again. Everything we had built together, the years of marriage, the trust, the love, it would all be gone in an instant. Grayson saw the fear in my eyes and smiled, satisfied. You see, Samantha, you have no choice. I own you now. And the sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us. I felt sick to my stomach, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Grayson had woven a web around me, and no matter how much I struggled, I couldn't break free. I hated myself for ever agreeing to his terms in the first place, for being so weak, so desperate to save James's career that I had sold my soul to a man like Grayson. Don't look so upset, Grayson said, his tone light as if we were discussing something trivial. I'm not asking for much. Just a little cooperation now and then. Keep me entertained, and I'll make sure everything stays the way it is. James will never know. You get to keep your perfect little life, and I get what I want. It's a win-win, really. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that this wasn't a win for me, that I was losing myself more and more with every second I spent in his presence. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, silent, my mind racing as I tried to figure out a way out of this. But there was none. Grayson had me cornered, and he knew it. When? I asked finally, my voice barely audible. Grayson's smile widened. Good girl. Tomorrow night. Same place as before. I nodded, unable to look him in the eye. I felt hollow, like a shell of the person I once was. I stood up to leave, but before I could walk away, Grayson grabbed my wrist, his grip firm but not painful. He pulled me closer, his lips brushing against my ear as he whispered, You belong to me now, Samantha. Don't forget that. I pulled away from him, my skin crawling at his touch, and walked out of the bar without looking back. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My hands were trembling, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I stumbled to my car, barely able to hold it together, and sat behind the wheel, staring at the steering wheel as tears blurred my vision. How had it come to this? How had I allowed myself to fall so far? I had always thought of myself as a strong, independent woman, but now, I was nothing more than a pawn in Grayson's game. I had sold my integrity, my body, all to protect James's career. And the worst part was, James had no idea what I had done for him. He had no idea that the price of his success was my soul. I sat there for what felt like hours, numb, my mind racing with guilt and shame. I wanted to go home, to crawl into bed next to James and pretend that none of this was happening. But I couldn't. The weight of what I had done, and what I was about to do again, was too much to bear. Finally, I drove home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. James was still out, probably celebrating with his colleagues, blissfully unaware of the storm that was raging inside me. I slipped inside, not bothering to turn on the lights, and made my way to the bedroom. I undressed mechanically, my mind a million miles away, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to quiet the voices in my head. But they wouldn't stop. They whispered all the things I didn't want to hear, all the truths I had been trying to avoid. You're a liar. A cheater. You betrayed him. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The guilt was too much, too overwhelming. I had ruined everything. And now, there was no going back. The next day passed in a blur. I avoided James as much as possible, afraid that he would see the guilt written all over my face. He was in high spirits, still basking in the glow of his promotion, and I hated myself even more for what I was about to do. I could barely look at him, let alone pretend that everything was fine. When the evening came, I made an excuse about having to work late again and left the house, my heart heavy with dread. I drove to Grayson's penthouse, each mile feeling like a step closer to my own doom. By the time I arrived, I was shaking, but I forced myself to get out of the car and walk to the door. Grayson was waiting for me, as smug and confident as ever. He didn't say much as he led me inside, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. He knew he had won. He knew I was too scared, too trapped, to say no. That night, I gave in again. I let him take what he wanted, because I didn't know how to fight him. I didn't know how to escape. And with each passing minute, I felt myself slipping further and further away from the person I used to be. When it was over, I left his penthouse in a daze, feeling more broken than ever. I drove home in silence, the weight of my betrayal crushing me. James was already asleep when I slipped into bed, and I lay there next to him, staring at the ceiling, feeling utterly alone. I had thought that I could live with this, that I could bury the guilt and move on. But now, I wasn't so sure. Grayson wasn't going to stop. He was going to keep taking, keep pushing, until there was nothing left of me. And the worst part was, I had no one to blame but myself. The days after that second night with Grayson felt like I was living in someone else's body, moving through my life like a puppet, detached and hollow. Each morning, I woke up beside James, feeling the warmth of his body next to mine, but I couldn't find any comfort in it. All I felt was guilt, thick and suffocating, wrapping around me like a shroud. James was happier than he'd been in months, blissfully unaware of the darkness I was drowning in. His career was soaring. He was receiving offers, invitations to prestigious legal panels, and the kind of attention that promised a future we had once dreamed about. I should have felt proud of him, of us. But all I felt was a gnawing sense of dread, knowing that the foundation of this new success was built on a lie. Grayson had kept his word. James had won the case, secured his promotion, and now, Grayson kept me on a leash, tightening his grip every time I thought I could breathe. He hadn't contacted me in a few days, but I knew it was only a matter of time before he reached out again. I lived in constant fear of that next message, that next demand, and I knew I wouldn't be able to say no. I tried to throw myself into work, into anything that could distract me from the overwhelming guilt. But even that was becoming difficult. I had been avoiding my colleagues, skipping social events, and avoiding the few friends I had left. The thought of being around people, pretending to be happy, pretending that everything was fine, was unbearable. One evening, James suggested we take a weekend trip, a small getaway to celebrate his promotion. Just the two of us, he said, his eyes bright with excitement. We haven't had much time for ourselves lately, and I think we both need this. The idea of getting away, of escaping the suffocating pressure of my double life, was tempting. But how could I relax when I knew what was hanging over me? How could I pretend that everything was okay when I was drowning in guilt? Still, I agreed, forcing a smile and telling him it sounded like a great idea. As we packed for the trip, I felt the weight of my phone in my pocket like a ticking bomb. Every time it buzzed, I jumped, expecting it to be Grayson with another demand, another reminder of the control he had over me. I checked my phone obsessively, even though I hated myself for doing it. But it wasn't Grayson. Not yet. The weekend came, and James and I drove upstate to a cozy little cabin by the lake. It was the perfect getaway, a picturesque retreat surrounded by nature, quiet and secluded. James was thrilled, acting like we were newlyweds again, holding my hand, planning hikes and lazy afternoons by the water. He was trying so hard to reconnect, and I hated myself even more for being unable to meet him halfway. The first night, we sat by the fire pit, sipping wine under the stars. James talked about the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead for his career, for us. I listened, nodding in all the right places, but my mind was far away, tangled in the web of lies I had woven. At one point, James turned to me, his expression soft, his voice low. "I feel like I've been neglecting us, Sam. This last year, with everything going on, I've been so focused on work that I lost sight of what really matters. I don't want to do that anymore. I want us to be okay. I need us to be okay." His words cut through me like a knife. I looked into his eyes, seeing the love and sincerity there, and for a brief moment, I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confess, to lay it all out in the open, and let him decide if he could forgive me. But I couldn't. The fear of losing him, of shattering the life we had built together, was too strong. I couldn't bear the thought of him looking at me with disgust, of him knowing what I had done to protect him. So, instead, I leaned in and kissed him, hoping that maybe, for just one night, I could forget. Maybe I could silence the guilt and be the woman he thought I was. We made love that night, the fire crackling beside us, the stars overhead. But even in that moment of intimacy, I felt the distance between us, a chasm growing wider with every lie I told, every secret I kept. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. My heart raced as I grabbed it, already knowing who it was, before I even looked. It was Grayson. "I hope you're enjoying your little getaway. But don't forget, Samantha, you belong to me. See you next week." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe, the walls closing in around me. Even here, in this peaceful retreat, Grayson had found a way to invade my life, to remind me that no matter how far I tried to run, he would always be there. I didn't tell James about the message. I couldn't. I pretended everything was fine, forcing myself to smile and laugh as we spent the day hiking and exploring the lake. But inside, I was crumbling. Every time James touched me, every time he smiled at me, I felt the guilt crashing down on me like a wave, drowning me in shame. The trip ended, and we returned home, but I felt no relief. The dread only grew as the days passed, knowing that my next encounter with Grayson was inevitable. He was like a storm, looming on the horizon, and I had no way to escape it. A few days later, the next demand came. Another message, cold and direct. "Tomorrow. 8 p.m. You know where." I stared at the screen, my stomach turning. I didn't want to go. I couldn't keep doing this. But the alternative was unthinkable. Grayson had the power to destroy everything, and I wasn't brave enough to stand up to him. I wasn't strong enough to face the consequences of my actions. That night, I made another excuse to James, telling him I had to work late. He didn't question it, he trusted me. And that made everything worse. When I arrived at Grayson's penthouse, the tension in the air was thick. He was waiting for me, as calm and composed as ever, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. This time, there was no small talk, no pretense of civility. He knew why I was there, and so did I. The encounter was cold, mechanical, like a transaction. I felt nothing but numbness as I let him take what he wanted. Each moment dragged on, suffocating me, until it was finally over. As I left his apartment, I felt like a ghost, hollow and drained. I couldn't even cry anymore. The guilt had consumed me so completely that there was no room left for anything else. I drove home in silence, barely registering the world around me. When I walked through the door, James was waiting in the living room, his face lit up by the glow of the TV. He looked up and smiled at me, but the smile faded when he saw my face. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern lacing his voice. I froze, standing in the doorway, my hands still trembling. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to collapse into his arms and beg for forgiveness. But instead, I nodded, forcing a weak smile. "I'm just tired," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. James stood up and crossed the room, pulling me into his arms. "You've been working too hard," he said softly, kissing the top of my head. "You need to take care of yourself." I closed my eyes, leaning into him, hating myself more than I ever thought possible. He had no idea. No idea what I had done, what I was still doing. He thought I was tired from work, from the long hours. But the truth was so much darker, so much uglier than he could ever imagine. That night, as I lay in bed next to him, I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The guilt was suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on me. I didn't know how much longer I could live like this, trapped in a web of lies and deceit. Grayson had his claws in me, and I couldn't see a way out. But deep down, I knew one thing: this couldn't go on forever. Something had to give. And when it did, the fallout would be devastating. Each day after that night with Grayson, I felt the walls of my life closing in around me. I couldn't escape the growing dread, the feeling that I was walking on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath my feet. I had thought I could live with the guilt, that I could bury it deep enough to survive. But the more time passed, the more it suffocated me, eroding the person I once was. James remained blissfully unaware, but even that couldn't last forever. The cracks in our marriage, once small and almost imperceptible, were growing. I could feel the distance between us widening, no matter how hard I tried to keep up appearances. I knew he sensed something was wrong. His questions had become more frequent, subtle at first, but now, they carried an edge of suspicion. "Are you sure everything's okay, Sam?" he asked one night as we sat down for dinner. His eyes searched mine, concern written across his face. "You've seemed distant lately. I know things have been stressful, but I'm here. You can talk to me." His words stung, and I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The weight of my deception was crushing, and the urge to confess was almost unbearable. But the fear of what would happen if I told him the truth kept my mouth shut. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Work's just been a lot. I'm sorry if I've seemed off." He reached across the table and took my hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to apologize. I just want to make sure you're okay. I miss you, Sam. I miss us." His words were like a dagger to my heart, twisting the guilt deeper. He didn't know. He couldn't know. But his love, his trust, it was unbearable, because I knew I didn't deserve any of it. "I miss us too," I whispered, blinking back tears that threatened to spill over. I wasn't even sure if that was true anymore. I missed the version of us that existed before I crossed the line, before Grayson had taken control of my life. But now, I didn't know who I was or what our marriage even stood for. The days turned into weeks, and Grayson's grip on me only tightened. He was careful, always discreet, always sending messages that couldn't be traced back to anything more than business. But his meaning was clear every time I saw his name flash on my screen. "We're not done, Samantha. You know what to do." I tried to keep up with the demands, to play along as if my life hadn't been turned upside down. But the pressure was too much, and it was starting to show. James noticed the late nights, the excuses, the way I pulled away from him more and more. He asked fewer questions now, but the tension between us was palpable. It felt like we were two strangers living in the same house, pretending to be a married couple when, in reality, everything was falling apart. Then, one night, everything changed. James had gone out for drinks with colleagues after work, and I was home alone, trying to find some semblance of peace in the silence. I hadn't heard from Grayson in a few days, and I was beginning to hope, stupidly, that maybe he had gotten bored, that maybe I could finally breathe again. But then my phone buzzed, and my heart sank. "We need to talk. Now." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew what that meant. Grayson didn't just want to talk. He never did. He wanted more. He always wanted more. I stood in the kitchen, my hands shaking as I typed out a reply. "I can't tonight. James is home soon." It was a weak excuse, and I knew it. But I had to try. I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep sacrificing pieces of myself to keep Grayson happy, to protect the fragile life I was desperately trying to hold on to. The response came almost immediately. "You don't get to say no, Samantha. You know what's at stake." My chest tightened. The familiar wave of panic washed over me, and I felt trapped, cornered. Grayson wasn't going to let me walk away. I had known that from the moment I had agreed to his terms. But how much more could I give before there was nothing left of me? I stared at the phone, my heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. But before I could make a decision, I heard the front door open. James was home early. I quickly shoved the phone into my pocket and turned around to greet him, my mind still reeling from Grayson's message. James walked in, a smile on his face, but it faded as soon as he saw me. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw suspicion flicker across his face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice casual, but edged with something darker. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, of course. Just tired." James studied me for a moment, his gaze lingering on my face. I could tell he wasn't buying it. He hadn't been buying it for a while now, but this was different. There was something in his eyes, something that made my heart pound in my chest. "You've been really distant lately," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I know work's been tough, but, is there something else going on? Something you're not telling me?" My stomach dropped. He was onto me. He didn't know the truth yet, but he could sense it, sense the lies, the secrets. I could feel the walls closing in, and I didn't know how to stop them from collapsing. "No, of course not," I lied again, the words coming out too quickly, too defensively. "It's just, I've been stressed. That's all." James frowned, clearly not convinced. "Sam, if there's something going on, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we can deal with it. But I need you to be honest with me." The guilt surged up inside me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I considered it. I considered telling him everything, about Grayson, about what I had done, about the price I had paid to save his career. But the fear, the crippling fear of losing him, of losing everything, held me back. I couldn't. I couldn't tell him. Not now. Not like this. "I am being honest," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though I could feel my hands trembling. "There's nothing going on. I just need some time to get my head straight." James stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine for some kind of truth, some kind of answer that would make everything make sense. But I couldn't give it to him. I couldn't give him the truth without destroying him. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, looking defeated. "Okay," he said quietly. "But if something changes, if you want to talk, I'm here." I nodded, grateful that he was giving me an out, even though I didn't deserve it. He kissed me on the forehead, a tender gesture that only deepened the ache in my chest, and then he walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where he had been, my mind a swirling mess of guilt and fear. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. But I didn't know how to break free. Later that night, after James had fallen asleep, I lay in bed, wide awake, my phone clutched in my hand. Grayson's message was still there, burning a hole in my mind. I knew what he was asking of me. I knew that if I didn't give in, he could ruin everything. But I also knew that if I kept giving in, I would lose myself completely. I had to do something. I had to find a way to get out from under Grayson's control, before it was too late. But how? The next morning, I woke up with a new resolve. I couldn't let Grayson keep controlling me. I couldn't keep sacrificing my life, my marriage, for his twisted games. I had to find a way to take back control, to stop him from ruining everything I had left. I thought about going to the police, but what would I say? That I had willingly slept with him to secure my husband's career and now he was blackmailing me for more? It would only blow up in my face. Grayson was too powerful, too connected. He had the ability to spin any story to his advantage, and I had no proof, no leverage against him. But maybe I didn't need proof. Maybe I just needed to outsmart him. Grayson was arrogant. He believed he had me under his thumb, that I would always come when called, do what he wanted without question. But if I could find a way to turn the tables, to make him think he had lost control, maybe, just maybe, I could break free. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only one I had. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep lying to James. I had to do something, even if it meant risking everything. That evening, when Grayson sent his next message, I was ready. Tonight. Same time. I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest, but this time, I didn't feel the same crushing dread. This time, I had a plan. I texted back, "I'll be there." But I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. Not anymore. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing as I replayed every interaction I had ever had with Grayson. Every word, every touch, every smug smirk. He thought he had me completely under his control. And for a while, he had. But something had snapped inside me during that last confrontation. I couldn't keep letting him win. I couldn't keep sacrificing myself, my marriage, to this man's twisted games. I had to take back control, even if it meant risking everything. The next day, I went through the motions of my routine, but I felt like I was operating on autopilot. James left for work early, kissing me on the cheek, telling me he'd see me for dinner. I smiled at him, but it felt brittle, like I was barely holding myself together. As soon as he left, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, thinking about what I was about to do. It was a risky plan, and part of me was terrified that it wouldn't work. Grayson was smart, smarter than most people gave him credit for. He had built his entire career on manipulating people, bending them to his will. But he was also arrogant. He believed he was invincible, that no one could touch him. And that arrogance was going to be his downfall. I spent most of the day preparing for that night, going over every detail of my plan, making sure I hadn't missed anything. There was no room for error. If Grayson sensed even the slightest hint of deception, it would all fall apart, and I would be worse off than before. I had to be smart. I had to play the part perfectly. That evening, I texted Grayson, confirming that I would meet him at the usual place. He replied almost immediately, his confidence evident in the brief response, "Good. Don't be late." I stared at the message, my stomach twisting with a mixture of fear and determination. This was it. I had to go through with it now. There was no turning back. I told James the first had to work late again, using the same excuse I had used a dozen times before. He barely questioned it anymore. I could see the frustration in his eyes, the way he was starting to pull away from me, just as I had pulled away from him. It killed me to see the distance between us growing, but I told myself it was temporary. Once I was free of Grayson, I could fix things. I could repair the damage I had caused. At least, that's what I hoped. I arrived at Grayson's penthouse just before 8 p.m., my heart racing as I stepped out of the elevator and into the sleek, modern hallway. Everything about this place screamed wealth and power, the kind of power that Grayson had wielded over me for far too long. but tonight, I was taking it back. He opened the door as soon as I knocked, his eyes scanning me with that same predatory gaze that always made my skin crawl. He was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his tie loosened slightly, as if to give the impression of casual ease. But there was nothing casual about the way he looked at me. He was in control, and he knew it. "Samantha," he said smoothly, stepping aside to let me in. "I'm glad you decided to come. I was starting to think you were getting cold feet." I forced a smile, keeping my voice steady. "I'm here, aren't I?" Grayson closed the door behind me, his eyes never leaving mine. "Yes, you are. Good girl." He walked past me, heading toward the living room, where he poured himself a drink. "I have to admit, I've enjoyed this arrangement we've had. It's been mutually beneficial, wouldn't you say?" I hated how calm he sounded, how in control he always seemed. But I couldn't let my emotions show. "Not yet." "I suppose so," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "But we both know this can't go on forever." Grayson raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his drink. "Can't it?" He smirked, clearly enjoying the game. "You and I have a good thing going, Samantha. Why end it now?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was the moment I had been dreading, but I had to go through with it. "Because I want out, Grayson. I'm done." His smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, setting his glass down on the table. "Out? That's not how this works, Samantha. You don't just get to walk away." I forced myself to stand tall, even though my heart was racing. "You got what you wanted, didn't you? James's career is secure. You've had your fun. It's over." Grayson took a step closer to me, his expression darkening. "You think you can just waltz in here and end this on your terms? After everything I've done for you? For James?" I swallowed hard, but I held my ground. "I don't owe you anything, Grayson. I've paid more than enough." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "You owe me everything, Samantha. And I think you know that." The air between us was thick with tension, and for a moment, I wondered if he would call my bluff, if he would push me harder, force me into a corner. But I had prepared for this. I had to stay in control. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small recording device, holding it up for him to see. Grayson's eyes narrowed as he stared at it, his smirk fading completely. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "It's exactly what you think it is," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've been recording our conversations, Grayson. All of them. Every message, every demand, every threat." His expression darkened, and for the first time I saw something close to fear flicker across his face. "You're bluffing." I shook my head. "I'm not. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. I have enough here to ruin you, to destroy everything you've built. You wouldn't survive a scandal like this. Not with your reputation." Grayson took a step closer, his eyes blazing with anger. "You really think you can take me down? After everything I've done for you?" I forced myself to meet his gaze, refusing to back down. "I don't need to take you down. All I need to do is walk away. But if you come after me, if you try to hurt me or James, I'll release everything. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of man you really are." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. For the first time, he wasn't in control. For the first time, he was the one on the defensive. "You have no idea what you're doing," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said quietly. "I'm taking my life back." Grayson glared at me, his eyes cold and furious, but he didn't say another word. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew that if he pushed me any further, I would follow through with my threat. And that was something even a man like Grayson couldn't afford. I turned and walked out of his penthouse without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had done it. I had finally taken control. But the fear, the guilt, it was still there, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had escaped Grayson's grip, but I wasn't free yet. I drove home in silence, my thoughts racing. What would happen now? Would Grayson come after me? Would he try to destroy me in some other way? Or would he finally leave me alone, knowing that I had the power to end him? When I got home, the house was dark. James was already asleep, unaware of the storm I had just weathered. I slipped into bed beside him, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. I had won this battle, but the war wasn't over yet. The next few days passed in a blur. I didn't hear from Grayson, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that it was over. But the guilt still clung to me, a constant reminder of the lies I had told, the secrets I had kept from James. I couldn't keep pretending forever. Sooner or later, the truth would have to come out. And then, one evening, everything came crashing down. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when James came home earlier than usual. I greeted him with a smile, but he didn't smile back. His face was pale, his expression tense. "James? What's wrong?" I asked, setting down the knife I had been holding. He stood there in the doorway, holding something in his hand. A piece of paper. No, not just any paper, a printout. My heart dropped as I recognized the words on the page. It was an email. From Grayson. I stared at the paper in James's hand, my blood turning to ice. I didn't even need to see the full email to know what it was. The shock on his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the printout, it all told me enough. Grayson had made his move. He wasn't done with me yet. "James," I began, my voice barely above a whisper, but he cut me off, his eyes burning with an emotion I had never seen in him before, betrayal. "Do you want to explain this, Sam?" His voice was tense, controlled, like he was holding himself together by a thread. He stepped closer, holding out the paper for me to take. My hand shook as I reached for it, dread tightening like a noose around my neck. The words on the page were like a punch to the gut. From Alexander Grayson. To James Anderson. Subject, a friendly heads up. James. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I believe you deserve to know the truth about what's been going on behind your back. Your wife, Samantha, and I have had a complicated relationship over the past several months. It started when she came to me to discuss your case, and well, let's just say things escalated from there. I don't think it's fair for you to continue living in the dark, believing that your marriage is built on trust, when that couldn't be further from the truth. If you want more details, I'm happy to provide them. But for now, I'll leave you with this: Samantha wasn't exactly honest with you about how you won that case. Maybe you should ask her what she's really been up to during all those late nights. Best. Grayson. The room spun as I read the email, my worst nightmare spilling out in front of me in black and white. Grayson had finally pulled the trigger. All of my careful planning, all of my attempts to contain the situation, had been for nothing. He had gone straight to James, detonating the truth in the most brutal way possible. My voice faltered, the words sticking in my throat. I didn't know where to start, how to explain the mess I had made of our lives. "James, I can explain." James let out a bitter laugh, his hand gripping the back of one of the kitchen chairs as if he needed something to steady himself. "Explain? You can explain this? Do you really think there's an explanation that makes this okay?" His voice cracked at the end, and it broke something inside me. I had never seen him like this, so hurt, so lost. I had always been the one he trusted, the one he leaned on, and now I had shattered that trust into 1,000 pieces. "I didn't want this to happen," I said, tears welling up in my eyes. "I never meant for it to go this far. Grayson, he manipulated me. He forced me into a corner." James's eyes flashed with anger. "A corner? You expect me to believe you had no choice? That you were some kind of victim in all of this?" I flinched at the accusation in his tone, but I couldn't blame him. How could I? He had every right to be furious, every right to feel betrayed. "James, please, just let me explain everything," I begged, my voice trembling. It started with the case, you were under so much pressure, and Grayson, he offered to help, but there were strings attached. James's face twisted in disgust. Strings attached? What exactly were those strings, Sam? Because I think I can guess. The shame I had been carrying for months now crashed over me in full force. I felt sick, weak, like I could barely stand under the weight of it all. I wanted to crawl into a hole, disappear, anything to avoid facing what I had done. I slept with him, I whispered, the words choking me as they left my mouth. It wasn't supposed to happen again, but Grayson kept threatening me. He kept. James slammed his hand down on the table, making me jump. So you kept doing it. You kept going to him. And for what, Sam? To protect me? To protect my career? Don't you see how twisted that is? I didn't know what else to do. I cried, tears streaming down my face. He had all the power. If I didn't do what he wanted, he would have destroyed everything. Your promotion, your reputation, he would have taken it all away. James looked at me like I was a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. The hurt in his eyes was unbearable. And what about us, Sam? What about our marriage? Did you think about what you were destroying in the process? Or did you convince yourself that somehow this was all justified, that you were doing the right thing? His words sliced through me, each one like a knife to the heart. I wanted to explain, to make him understand how trapped I had felt, but the truth was, there was no justification. There was no way to make this right. I had made choices, terrible choices, and now I was paying the price. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice cracking. I'm so sorry, James. He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes, but he blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Sorry isn't going to fix this, Sam. I don't even know who you are anymore. I took a step toward him, but he held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. The distance between us felt like a chasm, too wide to ever bridge again. James, please, I need some space, he said, his voice hoarse. I need to think. The finality in his tone was like a death sentence. I wanted to reach for him, to hold him, to make him understand how much I loved him, how much I regretted everything. But I had no right. I had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now, I had to face the consequences. James turned and walked toward the door, grabbing his coat and keys without looking back at me. I'll stay at a hotel tonight, he said quietly. Don't wait up. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the house, leaving me standing there in silence, alone with my guilt. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with sobs as I finally let the tears fall. I had lost him. I had lost everything. The next few days were a blur of pain and emptiness. James didn't come home. I didn't know where he was staying, and I didn't have the courage to call him. I spent hours replaying our last conversation in my head, wondering if there was anything I could have said or done to change the outcome. But no matter how many times I went over it, the truth was inescapable. I had betrayed him, and there was no undoing that. Grayson, of course, had gone silent. After sending that email, he had gotten what he wanted, chaos. He thrived on it, and I was sure he was sitting back, enjoying the destruction he had caused in my life. He hadn't even bothered to reach out to gloat. He didn't need to. The damage was done. One evening, after several days of radio silence, I decided to take a walk. The house felt too oppressive, too filled with memories of a life I had destroyed. I needed air, needed to escape the walls that seemed to be closing in on me. As I walked through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman James had fallen in love with. I had been confident, strong, independent. But now? Now I felt like a shell of that person, consumed by guilt and shame, haunted by the choices I had made. I didn't know if James would ever come back. I didn't know if he could forgive me. But more than anything, I didn't know if I could forgive myself. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of emptiness, of waiting for James to come home or at least call. But there was nothing. I kept checking my phone, hoping for some sign that he was ready to talk, ready to at least try to work things out. But each day, my hope dwindled a little more. Then, one evening, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt in my chest, thinking for a moment that it was James. Maybe he had finally come back. Maybe he was ready to hear me out. But when I opened the door, it wasn't James. It was Grayson. He stood there on the doorstep, looking as smug as ever, his hands casually in his pockets. "Surprised to see me?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. I stared at him in disbelief, my heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing here?" I spat, my anger flaring to life. "Haven't you done enough?" Grayson raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by my outburst. "I came to see how you were holding up. After all, it's been a rough couple of weeks for you, hasn't it?" My hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Get out of here, Grayson. I don't want to see you. I don't want to have anything to do with you." He chuckled, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Come on, Samantha. Don't be like that. We both know this isn't over yet. You think you can just walk away from me? After everything we've been through?" I glared at him, rage coursing through my veins. "It's over, Grayson. You don't have any power over me anymore." Grayson's smirk widened. "Oh, but I do. You see, you made one critical mistake, Samantha. You underestimated me." Before I could respond, Grayson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small, another envelope. He held it out to me, his expression smug. "What's that?" I asked, my voice tense, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. "This," he said, waving the envelope slightly, "is something I think you'll want to see." "Open it." I snatched the envelope from his hand and tore it open, my pulse racing. Inside were a few printed pages, photos. Photos of me, leaving his penthouse on multiple occasions. Photos of me walking through the door, of him standing next to me, his arm around my waist. Each one a damning piece of evidence that could ruin not only my marriage, but everything I had left. "I had a little insurance policy," Grayson said softly. "In case you ever decided to turn on me. You didn't really think I'd let you get away that easily, did you?" I stared at the photos, my stomach dropping, panic rising in my chest. He had planned this all along. He had played me, and now he was holding all the cards again. "You bastard," I hissed, my voice shaking with rage and fear. "You can't keep doing this." Grayson smiled, stepping closer, his voice low and menacing. "Oh, I can. And I will. Unless, of course, you do exactly as I say." I backed away from him, the photos clenched tightly in my hand. I had thought I was free, thought I had finally taken control of my life back. But Grayson had played the long game, and now he had me trapped again, just like before. "I own you, Samantha," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "And until I decide I'm done with you, you'll do exactly what I say. Or else. James gets these photos, and your life as you know it is over." Tears filled my eyes as I stared at the man who had ruined everything. I had tried so hard to escape, to break free from the chains he had put on me. But now, I was right back where I started, trapped, powerless, at his mercy. I couldn't see a way out. Not this time. The air between Grayson and me felt thick, suffocating. His smirk, that ever-present look of control, dug into me like knives. I stood frozen on the doorstep, the incriminating photos in my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly hopeless. I had thought I could fight my way out of this, but Grayson was always one step ahead, always ready with his next move. Now, I was trapped again, and the escape I thought I had gained was gone, replaced with another cruel game. He leaned closer, lowering his voice so it was barely more than a whisper. "I'm not asking for much, Samantha. Just more of the same. Keep up our arrangement, and I'll make sure no one, especially James, ever sees these. You keep your life, your marriage, your precious reputation. It's a small price to pay, isn't it?" I wanted to scream at him, to tell him to go to hell. I wanted to rip the photos into a million pieces, slam the door in his face, and walk away. But that's not how life worked with Grayson. He didn't make empty threats. He wouldn't hesitate to send these pictures to James or, worse, to ruin my life in ways I hadn't even thought of yet. This was his specialty: manipulation, coercion, complete domination over the people he saw as his pawns. I could feel my chest tightening, my throat closing up as I struggled to find my voice. "You've already taken everything from me. Why do you need more?" I asked, my voice small, broken. Grayson's smile widened, as if my suffering was something he enjoyed. "Because I can. And because you're valuable to me, Samantha. You've proven that. I'm not done with you yet." I turned away from him, walking back into the house as if my feet were moving on their own. I couldn't bear to look at him anymore, couldn't bear the smug satisfaction on his face. The door clicked shut behind me, but I could still feel his presence outside, lingering like a dark cloud over my life. The photos were crumpled in my hand, and I stood in the middle of the living room, staring down at them. My vision blurred with tears. How had it come to this? How had I allowed this man to take so much from me? My dignity, my marriage, my very sense of self, all of it had been slowly eroded by Grayson's relentless pursuit of control. I thought back to the woman I used to be. I was strong once. Independent. Someone who would never allow herself to be manipulated, never allow herself to be used. But now? Now I was a shadow of that person. Grayson had broken me down piece by piece, until I didn't even recognize myself anymore. I wanted to call James. I wanted to beg him to come home, to somehow fix this mess I had made. But how could I? He would never forgive me. Even if I somehow convinced him to look past the affair, these photos would crush whatever sliver of trust was left between us. I sank down onto the couch, the photos slipping from my hand and fluttering to the floor. My head fell into my hands, and for a long time I just sat there, trying to figure out what to do, how to escape. But no matter which way I turned it in my mind, the answer was always the same: Grayson had me. I was stuck. The days after Grayson's visit felt like a blur of numbness. I went through the motions of life, waking up, going to work, eating, but I wasn't really there. My mind was constantly spinning, trapped in a cycle of fear and hopelessness. I waited for the next message, the next demand from Grayson, knowing it was coming but dreading it all the same. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted in knots. James was still gone. After finding that email from Grayson, he hadn't come back. We hadn't spoken, and I hadn't tried to contact him. I didn't even know where he was staying. I wanted to reach out, to explain more, to at least try to make things right, but the guilt was too much. I had ruined everything. And now, with these photos hanging over my head, how could I ever hope to fix things? Then, late one night, I got another text from Grayson. "Tomorrow night. My place. Don't make me remind you why." My stomach dropped, and I felt bile rise in my throat. It was happening again. I couldn't do this anymore. But what choice did I have? Grayson had me backed into a corner, and no matter how much I wanted to fight, the consequences of refusing him were too terrifying to imagine. I spent the entire next day in a fog, barely able to focus at work, barely able to eat or think. My mind was consumed by the thought of what was coming. I knew what he wanted, what he always wanted. And this time I had no plan, no way out. The weight of it crushed me, making it hard to breathe. By the time evening rolled around, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. She looked tired, beaten down, her eyes hollow. I used to be proud of who I was. I used to walk with confidence, with purpose. But now, all I saw was a woman who had been pushed to the edge, who had lost everything and had no idea how to get it back. The hours dragged on, and before I knew it, it was time. I grabbed my coat and walked out of the house, my feet feeling heavy with every step. The drive to Grayson's penthouse was agonizing, each mile a reminder of how far I had fallen, of the dark path I was trapped on. When I arrived, I stood outside his door for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to run, to leave and never look back. But I couldn't. Grayson had made sure of that. With shaking hands, I knocked. The door opened almost immediately, and there he was, standing in front of me with that same smug smile. "Right on time," he said, stepping aside to let me in. I walked past him, my stomach churning, and entered the living room where everything had started all those months ago. "I knew you'd come," Grayson said, closing the door behind him. "You always do." I stood there, numb, not knowing what to say. There was nothing left to say. He had won, and we both knew it. Grayson walked over to me, his hand brushing lightly against my shoulder as he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "You're mine now, Samantha. You know that, don't you?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat was tight, and my mind was spinning. All I wanted was to get through this night, to survive, to somehow make it out with what little dignity I had left. Grayson took a step back, his eyes scanning me up and down, like he was assessing his prize. "Let's not waste any time," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You know what I want." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling as I struggled to hold myself together. I could feel the tears burning at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I wouldn't let him see me break. Not again. But just as Grayson reached for me, something inside me snapped. A spark of rage, of defiance, flared to life, and before I even realized what I was doing, I slapped his hand away. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm done with this. I'm done with you." Grayson's expression shifted from smug amusement to cold fury in an instant. "Excuse me," he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "You don't get to say no, Samantha. You don't have that option." I took a step back, my heart racing. "I don't care anymore. Do whatever you want. Ruin me. Send the photos. I don't care. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep letting you control me." For a moment, Grayson just stared at me, his face a mask of anger and disbelief. He had never expected me to stand up to him, never expected me to push back. He thought he had broken me completely, but somehow, I had found the strength to fight back, if only for a moment. "You're making a mistake," Grayson said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" I straightened up, feeling the smallest glimmer of power return to me. "I don't care about the consequences anymore. I'll deal with whatever comes. But I'm done. I'm done being your pawn." Grayson's eyes flashed with fury, but he didn't move. He didn't touch me. Instead, he simply stared at me, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. "You'll regret this," he said finally, his voice dripping with venom. "I promise you, Samantha, you'll regret this." I didn't say another word. I turned and walked out of his penthouse, my heart pounding, my hands still trembling. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how Grayson would retaliate or what the fallout would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had taken back some control. I had stood up to him, even if it meant everything would come crashing down around me. As I stepped into the elevator and the doors slid shut, I allowed myself a single deep breath. I didn't feel free. Not yet. But I had made the first step. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms. The next few days were tense, filled with a sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I knew Grayson wouldn't just let me walk away. He was too powerful, too vindictive. But I didn't care anymore. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. I didn't hear from James. The silence from him was deafening, and it ate away at me, filling the void in my chest with guilt and longing. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know how. What could I even say? And then, late one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed with a text. My heart raced, thinking it was Grayson again, but when I looked at the screen, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Grayson. It was James.